And now it's time for some self-reflections. Do you or does anyone you know have these attitude issues? Anti-authority, invulnerability, macho, impulsivity, or resignation? These are exactly what Ricky Brown writes about in his book, The Five Hazardous Attitudes, Ways to Win the War Within. He says these attitudes extend from your professional life into your personal life and could potentially harm relationships. He's also a U.S. Air Force veteran and former commercial pilot, and we're bringing him in live now to discuss this. Good morning, Ricky. Good to see you. Now, first, I want to hear a little bit more about your motivation to write this book. How do you expect will it help people?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Evelyn. So I was in a self-awareness cohort with about 5 other pastors, and we took a deep dive into self-awareness for about 7 months. And one of the things that we did was we studied the lives of leaders who had had a great public fall. And one of the consistencies we saw was hazardous attitudes. But as they began to share their story, each one of us experienced light bulbs going off because we were making some of those same mistakes. So it doesn't matter how talented you are or how gifted you are. If a person has a hazardous attitude, there is a crash waiting for you in your future.
Right, and I understand that these were also the 5 hazardous attitudes found that are often an issue when it came to plane crashes or just issues with pilots. So why are these attitudes important also when it comes to leadership? Maybe let's start with invulnerability.
Yeah, so I'm a former commercial pilot and a flight instructor, and the FAA found that these 5 hazardous attitudes have been involved in the majority of plane crashes. So it's only logical that if an attitude can crash an airplane, an attitude can crash a company, a career, a marriage, or a business. So I wrote 5 fables, including the one about invulnerability that you just mentioned, to illustrate the 5 hazardous attitudes so that we can learn a costly lesson from the characters without having to pay for that lesson ourselves, because pilots aren't the only people who sometimes crash.
All right, and I love a good story, maybe some illustrations. So talk to me about the macho attitude as well. How does it reflect in pilots and in bad leadership habits in general, if you can share some examples?
Sure. So career fields where you have to be very proficient in skill, but also make quick decisions are pilots, police officers, and physicians. You'll find yourself where you'll have to make a very quick decision, but with a great deal of skill. And so oftentimes when a macho attitude surfaces, there is a devaluing opinion of us that's present, and there is also a time constraint. So we have to learn how to turn down the devaluing opinions and begin to use the antidote for the hazardous attitude of macho, which is simply taking unnecessary risks is foolish. So in this book, Hazardous Attitude of Macho, I write a story about a young flight instructor named Haley Mitchell who decides to fly in conditions that were less than favorable and actually beyond the conditions she should have flown in. And so we get to see how that story plays out. And at the end of each chapter called Attitude Adjustments, where we drill down even more and examine what happened with the character and how can we prevent ourselves from experiencing that same calamity.
I think that's really interesting. And is that macho attitude, is it in any way connected to invulnerability? Is there a connection in how can vulnerability be important, and if someone does not have that, how can that be a weakness?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that for perspective, I've only met one person in my entire life that had all 5 of these, okay? So that should give the audience a little bit of relief. But as I prepared to write this book, I interviewed several psychologists, and what they shared is that oftentimes the root of a hazardous attitude is due to unresolved trauma. Okay, so it's important to note that, invulnerability is the hazardous attitude that says consequences happen, but they won't happen to me. So, what happens when a person pushes the envelope or they do things that are risky or maybe even illegal and they don't pay a penalty or a price? It only emboldens them even more to try something greater in the future, if that makes sense. So, trauma does not necessarily always have to be something bad. Trauma can be the absence of bad that causes something even worse.
I see. Yeah, it's always good to dig deeper. And thank you for putting this into perspective. Maybe some people are having a sigh of relief right now that it's not that all of them are present usually. Tell me a little bit more about those attitudes and being aware of them in somebody's personal life. How is that important?
So, your attitude determines your altitude. And the problem is when a person has a hazardous attitude, oftentimes they are the last person to know it. So, what we encourage people to do is to read the book in community, read it in a small group or a setting where there's someone in your life that can hold you accountable to your miss. Because this book is a self awareness journey. It's a journey of self awareness because those leaders who are not self aware will always have a ceiling on their leadership. They'll always top out. And oftentimes, everyone knows it but them. If it's a coworker, you're the coworker that everyone is waiting for you to turn in your resignation because you push the envelope, you lack self-awareness, you don't do things that you should do, or maybe you omit things that you should do. So the key is going on this journey just like I did with other people in relationship where you can hold each other accountable and become more self-aware together. Because if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That's a great African proverb that's often quoted.
And I love it. Thank you so much, Ricky Brown. I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.